Emblem Awakening is a tactical RPG from Intelligent Systems and the 13th game in the long-running series. It will now get reviewed. So it's a bit hard to look at one Fire Emblem game in isolation, because the mechanics have been part of a large chain of iterations, and the franchise also exists as part of a larger genre of tactical RPGs, and they share a lot of mechanics, so a little bit of comparing needs to happen as well. I'm also going to do one last bit of preamble before we get going. We need to differentiate between tactics and strategy, which sometimes people use interchangeably in lay speak, but here we need to be really specific. So a strategy is a plan, often larger in scale and general, and it guides specific smaller choices, all in the name of achieving some goal. So if you're playing a game like Civilization, your goal might be military victory, and in a city you own, you might decide to make a building that'll increase the city's production so that they can make military units faster. Tactics are different. They refer to positioning, orientation, and other relationships between objects, like soldiers, and it's usually in a competitive arena. If you're playing football, how each side lines up before a play is a small tactical decision. There's a relationship between strategy and tactics. If we keep going with the American football metaphor, maybe we know the other team's quarterback doesn't do well under pressure, so we might opt to blitz him more often to try exploiting that weakness. The strategy is blitz the quarterback lots, but the tactics deal with the specifics of how you're going to position your players to accomplish that. Maybe you can throw everyone at the quarterback, but maybe they've got a star player that you still need to focus on, despite the fact that you want to go after the quarterback, and those details are tactics. Okay, so let's talk Fire Emblem. The series has always revolved around grid-based battles between forces. You move your units around the grid, and you fight the units on the other team. Units each have their own stats, which determine their fighting capabilities, and these stats go up as they gain experience fighting. Your goal is usually to defeat all the enemy units. Sometimes there's a little bit of spice thrown in, like you gotta protect a third party, or you just have to take out the enemy leader, but usually those boil down to wiping out all of the enemy units, so let's just be real. Your goal is to kill everything every time. The tactical play comes in the form of a few different mechanics. As mentioned, the units are on a grid, so your goal is to position your units to let you divide and conquer the enemy. That's pretty common to every tactical game, or it should be. The twist is that in Fire Emblem games, when two units fight, they both get a chance to attack each other, unless someone, gets killed first. Most tactical games are based around wiping out enemy units on your turn so that they can't counterattack. But in Fire Emblem that won't work because you can get hit on your turn already. So if you've got, say, a really strong boss enemy, you can't throw a whole bunch of scrubs at him because he will just kill all of them. So Fire Emblem games are really about getting favorable matchups. And that's going to lead us to something I want to talk about called the weapon triangle. So the weapon triangle is a Fire Emblem game mechanic introduced, I'm going to say around Fire Emblem 10, and it superficially resembles rock, paper, scissors. There's three major groups of weapons: swords, lances, and axes. A sword beats an axe beats a lance beats a sword. The reason this only superficially resembles rock, paper, scissors, though, is because both sides can see the weapons the other people are using. Rock, paper, scissors, you have to guess what they're going to do and counter it. In this, everybody knows what's going on, and your goal is positioning your units so that you have the favorable matchups. This is good. It's tactical because we are talking about moving units specific ways. As an aside, I play a lot of tactical RPGs, and I play a lot of 4X games, and a lot of 4X games claim to have tactical combat, but it's been a while since I played one that had anything interesting going on, so I want to do a little side trip here. All that stuff I said about having to position units to get an advantage is basically what tactics are for. If a game has combat on a grid, or claims to have tactical combat where you can move your ships around, but it doesn't really have systems in place to make orientation and distance really matter, then the tactical battle's not going to work. So if I have ranged weapons, I want to shoot the enemy at range, and if I have melee weapons, I want to rush them. That's all there is. It's got one tactic, and you have to use it every time, basically. So here, the only strategy is just shoot everything. Even big, slow ships turn fast enough that they can't really be flanked, because even the little ones got to keep circling them. So orientation doesn't really matter. You're just throwing numbers at each other. And here they built this engine to show you the battle, but you don't control anything. There's no tactics. These games might feature strategic decisions about when you choose to engage an enemy and how you research and design your ships, and maybe even some tactical stuff on the map where you try to bottleneck certain areas of space, but once combat starts, you have just one optimal tactic to use. So if you're an aspiring game designer, or you're just a gamer that wants to be less happy about everything, here's a simple test you can do to see if the game has real tactical combat or is just a facade. Is a smaller, weaker force able to destroy a larger, stronger force through tactical play, such as engaging smaller groups of them at a time? If both sides just line up and attack each other, are the results drastically different compared to if you try really hard? If there are multiple battles between similar forces, do they all tend to go the same way, every time? So if you answered yes, yes, and no, you got tactical combat. And here's one other question for bonus marks. If you were telling the story of what happened in a given battle, how often would you use words like therefore or but? Start the but counter. Example, I sent my mage to attack their knight, but that put my mage in range of their archer. You see, video games are really about narratives. They're little stories. Most people assume that means they're about campaign modes that have stories. But even simple multiplayer first-person shooter death matches are about narrative. I shot at him, but I missed. Therefore, I had to retreat. Therefore, he chased me, but I had a good teammate who was a sniper. Therefore, they shot him in the head. That's 3 therefores and 2 buts in like 5 seconds of gameplay. And all of that verbiage was also about tactics. Taking a chance to attack, failing, retreating, which really means increasing the distance between opposing units, creating an opportunity for another unit in good position, boom, the kill shot. For a game to have tactical quality, it's got to have tactical decisions. Want to know why the combat in all those 4X games I mentioned sucks? There's no good buts. I showed up, I had more firepower, therefore I killed them, easily. The only buts are things like, but they tried to hide behind an asteroid, but I went around the asteroid so they didn't really hide. Or, but there aren't asteroids in this game. See, the beauty of Fire Emblem is it gets these things right. Your forces are usually smaller than the enemy with less cumulative strength, but usually with slightly better units. So if you can reduce the enemy to a smaller set of one-on-one battles, you can get victory in the small battles. But those exchanges will weaken your forces because the enemy can still counterattack. And the enemy will attack you on their turn, and that'll force an engagement. But you can have a unit help your units recover before that happens, but if that unit is killed, you're screwed. Therefore, you need to position them in a safe spot. But it needs to be close enough to your units to help them. Just trust me, the fine folks at Intelligent Systems understand this stuff. In Fire Emblem Awakening, you start the game with 4 units. One's a healer, and I just mentioned the tactical implications of having a healer. One of them's a traditional Fire Emblem lore character who's a sword-wielding unit who's generally quite good. Hey, we just talked about the tactical implications of having a pretty good unit who could win one-on-one battles but can't go rushing in. And 2 others, both of which have important tactical and strategic value as well. One of them is Frederick, a really strong unit who levels up slowly. Getting a unit like this near the start is pretty common in Fire Emblem games. Frederick can crush everyone easily. He uses swords and lances and axes if you want, so the weapon triangle is always in his favor. But if he gets all the kills, he gets all the experience points. But that means other characters don't get experience points. And that means that as the enemies get stronger, Frederick is going to get stronger too, but not as fast, because I just told you he levels slowly. But your other characters won't be leveling at all. Therefore, you will have a problem, because one of them is your healer, and the other 2 will give you a game over if they die. Therefore, even though Frederick can kill all the enemies early on, he shouldn't, because it's more complicated than just winning the tactical battle today. And thus, the strategic game and the tactical game flow into one another, because now we are concerned about the development of our group beyond just winning the battle. The 4th unit is the Avatar, the character you make and customize. They're a tactician, which is a unit that can use swords and tomes. See, I mentioned the weapon triangle, but it's not that simple. There are also bows and tomes, and other things I might be forgetting. Bows have long range, so they can hit units far away, but they cannot hit units at close range. So under some circumstances, they can hit the enemy without any fear of a counterattack, and other times, they just get stomped. So if the units are positioned a certain way, they're really good, but not always. Tomes are great. Tomes can attack at melee range or at distance, so they're very versatile. They're also magical, so rather than getting boosted by your strength stat and reduced by your opponent's defense stat, they're boosted by magic and reduced by resistance. Basically, there's just a second set of stats governing their damage, and many enemies are specialized in one area or the other. So if an enemy has really high defense, Crom and Frederick might struggle to defeat them, but if you go after them with magic, you're set. What's the catch? Well, if you're attacking with Tomes, you can go after the melee units at long range and the ranged units at short range on your turn, and great, that's free damage, but when it's the enemy's turn, and they'll get one, they will get their chance to pick the range, and hopefully you didn't overextend that one unit who is kind of a wild card, because they can't usually take all that much damage, and if you're playing on classic mode, where death is permanent, well, that spellcaster might only be able to tolerate 1 or 2 hits, and then they're gone forever. So Fire Emblem Awakening also has another mechanic called support in it. When units are standing beside each other, they can support each other, which basically means there's a small chance, at first, it'll become bigger later, that they'll help each other in combat. Sometimes getting an extra hit on an enemy, or protecting them from an incoming blow, negating the damage. This is another good tactical twist, because if you have multiple units attacking one enemy, the optimal formation is not for them to be standing beside each other. It's for them to be diagonal to each other, so you can surround the enemy and everybody can get a shot in. But they don't gain support levels this way. You don't get chances at multiple attacks this way, so you have to be a bit tactical about your decisions to do this. Units that support each other a lot will get better at it, raising the chances that they'll support each other more often, and it'll unlock fun conversations. Some units can get to know each other so well, they fall in love, and you can play the matchmaker, basically. This is cool, because the game also has a little time travel quirk, and they use it just the right amount, they don't get too caught up in things. And this feeds back into the strategic and tactical aspects, because these people in love can have kids, which can join your party very quickly as adults because time travel. And this means you can breed super soldiers. And you know what? If all of this seems complicated, remember, you don't actually need to worry about all this. I'm breaking down the mechanics, but you don't need to use all of them. As a matter of fact, you don't even really need to know most of them exist. The game can be quite simple with you just worrying about general formations, hitting enemies, but as you get into more difficult situations, you will have the tools at your disposal to get better, to play better. This is great. It's a system that works for newcomers and pros alike, and none of it is artificially gated off until the game arbitrarily says, okay, you guys can have your kids now. It's all there, and if you understand it, you can use it. And if you don't, that's fine. I've been gushing about the series and the game pretty hard, so I'm just going to throw out a few criticisms right now. First, the weapon triangle only grants a really tiny bonus, and honestly, you can get away with ignoring it pretty effectively. I don't think it should give an insurmountable advantage, but in this game the weapon triangle matchup seems a bit small given the scale the numbers operate, and it only gives you a really tiny advantage to your damage, and maybe you take a little bit less damage back and your accuracy gets a tiny boost or penalty. But it was introduced in previous Fire Emblem games, and Fire Emblem Awakening, the stats, the just general scale of the numbers, is a little bit higher than most other Fire Emblem games. Some of the more conservative ones, all the numbers are kind of like half. So its potency should have risen to match the larger scale of the numbers in Fire Emblem Awakening. Second, the enemy AI could be a little bit better at working as a team. Usually the enemy seems like a group of individuals making decisions that work for them personally, but they don't often use group strategies, and sometimes I think that the player can game against this a little too effectively. That said, the AI map design is still better than most Fire Emblem games in this one. Beef the third. You either have permanent death turned on or off. I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit of a gradient here. XCOM uses a system where the amount of damage a unit takes in a mission determines how much recovery time they need, and getting knocked to 0 HP is sometimes lethal and sometimes not. I like that. Final Fantasy Tactics has a rule that if a unit reaches 0 HP, they're knocked out and dying, but you have a limited amount of time to either win the battle or assist them. If you don't, then they're gone forever. Fire Emblem Echoes even lets you just turn back time up to 3 times in a battle, and you can go back as far or as little as you want. And so if someone dies, you could reverse that, but you only get 3 chances. All of these are nice middle-of-the-road solutions. Given that critical hits in this game do triple damage and basically are almost always going to kill a unit on either side, it's nice to have something to protect you from, getting a bad luck roll on a 1% crit chance or something like that. Over the course of the game, you're gonna get hit with a couple of them, and when permadeath is on, it can be pretty frustrating. And I don't know if it's a complaint, but I'm gonna bring it up. Characters don't have a physical orientation in battle, which is actually a bit unusual for tactical games. Normally it's not really a fancy choice, it's a pretty basic calculation, but it has tactical implications. In Fire Emblem, there's no concept of sneaking up behind someone. I wouldn't mind seeing like this added though, where like if you attack someone from behind, they can't counterattack, and it would discourage you from lone wolfing it, which is something strong units can usually get away with. The story in Fire Emblem Awakening is pretty much par for the course for a Fire Emblem game. There's usually like an initial conflict, it's very sort of political drama. It doesn't get too deep and dark into it like a Final Fantasy Tactics or anything Yasumi Matsuno has ever thought. But, you know, there's a struggle, and then usually there's some sort of twist, and you end up in a different large-scale conflict. Sometimes it's a new bully in town, sometimes everything collapses around you, but that's the arc of every Fire Emblem game. So, if someone were to ask you, what are the stories of Fire Emblem games? What are all of them like? You can just say, this. So, is it a good story? It's okay. It has some strong points, has a couple key weak points that I'll pick on later. But Fire Emblem games have a lot of characters in them. They need to, because if you have permadeath on, you need, you know, plan B in place. And the entire crew, I think, is a really good bunch overall. One of the gags I'm gonna mention is this guy named Kellum, who's a big guy and he wears giant armor, and the joke is nobody ever notices that he's there. You meet him when you get introduced to this group of soldiers called the Shepherds, and they join you and you go on several battles, and then in a new battle, he's just there all of a sudden, and you're kind of like, where did you come from? And he's like, I've been with you this whole time. And he was, you just never noticed him. I like that. What I especially like is that deep down, most people think it's kind of a goofy gag and it's not that believable, but let me ask you this. Did you notice him on the cover of the game? Because he's there. The game gets a lot of strong replay value from pairing up people in different ways and checking out different support conversations, and they add a lot of really nice flavor to the game. Each series of support conversations is usually a small, short story featuring those two characters, and overall they're pretty great. I've mentioned the game has a time travel quirk in it, and I think it's one of the better uses of it. Again, they mostly used it just as a way of, you know, having a question of fate. Do we have free will, or is it all predestined, and can you change the past if you time travel to the past and start physically changing things? And, you know, will history forcefully recorrect itself and so on? And it's kind of interesting, and they don't go too far about trying to do weird stuff like erasing people from history in the past and so on. So I like that. It's basically Terminator 1. The game does have some weak non-choices. On 2 occasions they'll do this thing in the game where they'll ask you like, do you want to do this thing or not? And whichever way you pick, it goes the same way. Now in a lot of games they do it the bad way where, you know, it just kind of ignores you. But thou must. In this one, other people interfere on your actions. I don't mind that as much. That's kind of realistic. A lot of the time in life, you'll make a choice and then someone will override it in some way or another. They'll trump your free will with theirs. It's the first time this happens in the game. I think it works. The second time, it kind of upset me and would have been a super cool twist if they'd permitted it. And you know what? Let's throw in a spoiler right here. The whole premise of the story, or a major point in it, is you start seeing the future and you kill Crom, and he's your best friend, and he's like, hey, I don't blame you, and then he dies, and it causes the future to be ruined. And when you go through history again, I think it would be a really cool twist if Crom did get killed, and the twist was, well, Lucina has come back in time, and she's there to sort of like assume the mantle, and now like the difference isn't that she prevented the assassination, the difference is that she exists now. It would be neat. What they actually did was like, hey, I knew you were gonna stab me, but you kind of dialed it back because there's some good in you this time around, and I don't know. And we love each other. Collectively, we have group love. It would have been cooler if Crom's dead. Would have been cooler. Another spoiler, Lucina just cut the Avatar's head off. That would have been cool. The conversation leading up to that moment is beautiful. you know, Lucina pulls you aside after she sees you can, under some circumstances, do some kind of sketchy things, and she just says, look, when I was growing up, I heard my father was a great man, but now that I've seen it in person, I can see that if he dies, the world is going to be denied a great leader, and I can't let that happen. And you're kind of like, yeah, I know, right? Crom's great. And she's like, I'm here to kill you. It's, man, that would be great if they let her go through with it. Because you can choose to say, like, no, don't kill me. You could be her mother, depending on how stuff worked out, in which case she can't bring herself to kill her own mother. But, I don't like that they chickened out from that. That would have been friggin' nuts. Alright, spoilers over. The music. We're going to talk arts and crafts. The music in the game is good. I wouldn't say it's great, but it's good and sometimes very good. It would be nice to have slightly more battle tracks because you spend a lot of time in battles in this game. I don't know, there's maybe 5 or 6. They've got a bazillion jingles for when people are having support conversations, but not so much for what you're doing for 75% of the time. So it's a small beef. Again, what they have there is pretty good, so it's not the end of the world. Okay, let's talk visual art. The UI design in the game is okay. It's a big deal because you do spend some time menuing. The layout and the way the items are managed is a bit archaic, and it is time for them to buck tradition and just get with the times and rethink the UI and do it properly. They did it a little bit 2 games later in Fire Emblem Echoes, but they need to go further, or at least get with the 90s. You don't even have to get with the times now, just get us up to 1998. It's really archaic. Character art itself in the game is, I think, beautiful and possibly my favorite individual in-game art of all time. And the cutscenes are probably the best anime-style cutscenes I've ever seen in my life. So good job, art team. If you're animating something and you're gonna do 3D models and you want it to look kind of like a cartoon, this is what it should look like. This is what all of them should look like. In the game proper, I'm a little torn. The 3D models that you see interacting on the battlefield are kind of par for the course for 3DS games, although people like to point out they have absurdly tiny feet. And the team gave a couple responses with oh, that was a technical issue just because of 3DS performance. That's not it. It was an artistic decision, not a technical one. I know enough about 3D modeling to know that there's a vertex there. They could have just stretched it out to make triangle feet and people would have forgiven it. So, nice try. The pixel art for the battle maps is good enough, but with the light of hindsight, I can now say we've got 3 Fire Emblem games on the 3DS all doing this style, and it might be nice to see them push a bit further. And with the cutscene art being as beautiful as it is, it just leaves me wanting a little bit more. And honestly, maybe the Nintendo Switch is going to take care of this for us, because it's still portable if they want to stick portable, and it's got the firepower, and to see, if we had a Fire Emblem game with the fidelity of those cutscenes, or close to it, in live action, oh, that would just be beautiful to look at. And being exposed to really good music and really good art, I think, is a big part of fun. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm just about the gameplay, I'm just about the game. This is the game. You're pressing random buttons on a box, and the reason it's fun is because the game is showing you a visual that makes you believe there's a connection between the two. And the game makes the connection real, but it's still all going through your eyes and your ears. So, overall, I love this game. As far as I can tell, the only people who dislike this game are super traditionalist Fire Emblem fans that are a pretty tough crowd to please in general, and people who aren't really just giving it a chance. I don't like cartoons. You want to make beautiful people have cute conversations and fall in love? Great, this game's for you. Want to slaughter all of your enemies with the product of your own eugenics program? This game's still for you. If you have any love for gaming at all, then I think this is a game for you to enjoy. I've played it through 3 times, and each time has been completely fantastic. And sometimes people will say that and they'll think well, there hasn't been much drop off. I mean, each time has been awesome. 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think there is potential with the Fire Emblem formula to make a perfect game, and this is so close to it. So I'm just gonna cut it back a little bit. But Fire Emblem Awakening is a beautiful game. In my opinion, it is the best iteration of Fire Emblem of all time, and you should just play it.